our lineup of speakers are almost a dream team of folks with expertise in various subject matters. Last night we started, of course, with Robert Jeffress. What a blessing that was. And this morning, David Barton is here to share with us. Now, many of you know that David Barton is the founder of Wall Builders, an organization dedicated to recalling America's Christian heritage and calling Christians to be what? Well, just what Robert said last night, salt and light here in our beloved nation. He frequently cites George Washington. I was just sharing a quote a moment ago with him. But Washington said, the propitious, I can't even say it, but the favorable smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation which disregards the eternal rules of order and right which heaven itself has ordained. As he said, sounds like a deist to me, huh? Well, David is an avid and accurate student of history, real history, not the revised kind that they're indoctrinating kids with in schools and universities today, and he travels around the nation to help restore America's moral, religious, and constitutional foundation. You know, in 2005, Time magazine cited him as one of the 25 most influential evangelicals in the nation. I told him already, perhaps there's no better testimony to his effectiveness and calling than the fact that the leftist Southern Poverty Law Center considers him to be a menace for spreading what they call the damaging idea that the separation of church and state is a myth. Well, it is a myth. And David, thank you for making that clear. We're so delighted that David and his wife, Cheryl, could be here. David, come and bless us, please.
It is good to be with you this morning. I want to start with the Bible verse, a fairly simple Bible verse. It's Proverbs 10:22. It says, "The blessing of the Lord, it maketh rich, and he addeth no sorrow to it." And what we find in a verse like that is God's blessing is something that enriches our life. And it turns out that some of the greatest blessings we have are things we don't often notice. I learned this from a founding father named Benjamin Rush. Out of the 250 founding fathers we have, John Adams said that the top 3 founding fathers were George Washington, Ben Franklin, and Benjamin Rush. Now, we know little about him today, unfortunately. Very good guy. He started the Sunday school movement in America, started the first Bible Society in America. He started the first abolition movement in America. He's the most famous doctor in American history. He's called the father of American medicine. Started 5 universities. He's called the father of public schools under the Constitution, and on it goes and on it goes. He just did a number of amazing things. We have a collection of about 160,000 items from American history, ranging from Columbus all the way through the Bible that landed on the moon with Apollo 14. And among that, we have thousands and thousands of documents of what we call our founding fathers, including a number of documents of Benjamin Rush. We have his prayer journal, and as he's reading through the Word, he'll write down things that God's showing him out of the Word, and speaks to him out of the Word as he goes through. So he has a lot of things to say. And as I was reading his works, he was trying to be a solid Christian, thanking God. He was being grateful for all the blessings he had. And he was listing all these blessings, and he would check, yeah, that's good, that's good. But he got to one where he says, "I thank God for all the times that I have not fallen down the stairs." Run that by me again. I'll point out, I just ran up the stairs and nobody noticed it. Why didn't you notice it? Because I didn't fall. If I'd fallen, you would have noticed it, and that would not have been a blessing. The blessing was it wasn't noticed. It turns out that some of the greatest blessings we have in life are things we don't notice. You drive to the store, you come back, you don't have a wreck, you don't think about it. If you had a wreck, you would notice it, and that's not the blessing. So having your health until something happens, or having your family until something happens, or having a job until something happens, some of the greatest blessings we have are things we take for granted. And I would say that there is no place on the face of the earth that takes their blessings more for granted than we do as Americans. We're so used to those blessings, we don't even think about them anymore. And there's a lot of ways of pointing that out. If I take you, for example, to the government we have. Now, we're one of 193 nations this year at the United Nations. There's 193 nations in the world. They all have a government of some type. And governments have been here for a long time. 5,800 years of recorded history, thousands of nations, hundreds of constitutions. And the Constitution we have, how does it rank with the others. Cornell University Law School asked the question, what's the average length of a constitution in the history of the world? How long does a constitution usually last over those 5,800 years? And the answer they found was 17 years. Going back and researching all those thousands of nations, 17 years, the length of the average constitution. Last September the 17th, on Constitution Day, we celebrated 235 years under the same document. Now, we set a world's record every year, and most people don't even know when Constitution Day comes and goes because we're just so used to being stable, so used to being all the stuff we have that we don't even think about it. It's just another year, you know, nothing big. But the same thing happens when you look at creativity. Now, in terms of world population, America is 4% of the world's population. 4% of the world's population should produce 4% of the world's whatever. When you look at creativity, we can measure that through things like international copyright, international patent protection, etc. And if you look, America, out of all the science, out of all the technology, out of all the cures, out of all the discoveries, our 4% every year produces more than 96% of the world's creativity. We're surrounded with stuff that the rest of the world would die to have, and we just take it for granted because we've got it every day. And this is the way it's been for a number of years. And even when you look at prosperity, our 4% of the world's population routinely produces 23, 24, 25% of the world's gross domestic product. And we don't produce more because we have more, because that's not the case. I happen to be a cowboy from out west of here, got the farm, the ranch, the cowboy, the cows, the horses, everything that goes with it. And it's interesting that America is number 99 in the world in percentage of farmable land. Yet we are number 2 in the world in agricultural production. We take what we have and make it go further than any other nation, and that prosperity reaches all the way down to the individual level. We do a census every 10 years required by the Constitution, and we did a census in 2020. The results were released in 2021, and according to the census data, if you live in poverty in America, and we don't want anyone living in poverty here, but if you live in poverty in America, your lifestyle is higher than the middle class in Europe, which is the second wealthiest place on the face of the earth. So being poor in America is being a higher lifestyle than in Europe. You see, this is why right now on the southern border, the State Department says we have people from 127 nations trying to get in. If they can just come be poor in America, they have elevated their lifestyle beyond their wildest dreams. So we don't understand the blessings we have. This is what's often known as American exceptionalism. This is a term that was given us in 1831 by a guy named Alexis de Tocqueville. He was a Frenchman who came here, traveled the country, spent 8 months here. He wrote a book called Democracy in America. He said the condition of the Americans is quite exceptional, and it made me believe that no democratic people will ever be placed in a similar position. So we get that term American exceptionalism, and with American exceptionalism, what produces it? How did it come? Well, if you go back to George Washington, Tim was quoting George Washington a moment ago. If you go back to George Washington, the father of the country, he spent 45 years of service for the nation, military service, political service, all types of service for America. At the end of 45 years, he retires after 2 terms as president, and in his farewell address, he gives advice to keep the nation moving in the right direction. He said, okay, guys, now remember, this is what got us here, and if we're going to stay as a nation, we've got to keep doing this. And so he goes through and gives about a dozen warnings, and they are terrific warnings. They are really good even to this day. For example, one of the things Washington warned about 200 years ago, actually 1796, so 227 years ago, he said, do not ever, there we go, switch it.
Thanks, Tim. He said, do not ever let the government get into deficit spending. Really good idea. We've had that warning for a long time. Now, what's significant with Washington's farewell address is it used to be that for your first 8 years of school in America, you took a written exam on his farewell address once a year for the first 8 years of school. We knew that stuff. We knew what was in it. We knew the content that was there. Significantly, we took a written exam every year for the first 8 years of school on the Constitution, the Declaration, the state Constitution, and on Washington's farewell address. So we knew these principles very well. Washington, in that farewell address, talks about political prosperity. And political prosperity is something we really wish we could have now. We're more polarized, I think, than we've been at any point since the Civil War. We don't know what truth looks like anymore. Half the nation makes up its own truth. The other half claims there is truth. We've got a conflict going that's pretty severe. And Washington talked about how to have political prosperity. He said, of all the habits and dispositions that lead to political prosperity, he said, everything that makes your politics work right, he said, religion and morality are indispensable supports. So if you want your politics to work well, the one thing you do not do is you do not separate religion and morality from politics. Now, that's what he said. That's what we studied for all those years. That was his warning to us, and we don't know this address anymore. We don't know these principles. We definitely separate religion and morality from politics. We do that on a regular basis, even in church. Oh, church, we can't be political. No. If you want your politics to prosper, the church better be involved in politics as well, because you need the religion and morality. As he pointed out, he said, in vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness. He said, here's the litmus test. You cannot be called a patriot if you do things that separate religion and morality from the political life. Now, I've been involved in 13 cases of the U.S. Supreme Court. Supreme Court is the one who separated religion and morality from public life for over 60 years. I will say the court has changed that. Religious liberty cases usually win a religious liberty case once every 8-9 years, something of the sort. In the last 4 years, we've won 11 religious liberty cases. We have more religious liberty, literally have more religious liberty now than what we've had in 60 years. Now, we have a network of legislators, Wall Builders Pro-Family Legislative Network, about 1,000 legislators in that network. We monitored 157,000 pieces of state legislation last year. This type of stuff going through now, for example, on Monday, I go down to the state legislature in Texas to testify because we're working on a bill that will post the 10 Commandments in every single classroom in the state of Texas. Now, that's the kind of stuff we can now do as a result of what is happened in the last few years. Oklahoma's trying to put prayer back in the classrooms, prayer back in schools. All this stuff that's been gone for 60 years is starting to try to come back. But again, going to what Washington said, he said, you can't call yourself a patriot if you try to secularize the public square. Now, that's what's happened. And so secular now that when you look at where we are with Bible reading in America, if you go back to the American Bible Society, now remember, religion and morality is what produces political prosperity. So if you want your politics to prosper, you promote religion and morality. And this is where the Bible is so significant. That's a source of religion and morality for us. And as you look at the Bible, the American Bible Society is the oldest national Bible society in the world. It was started in 1816 by our founding fathers. And it was started by signers of the Constitution. It started by justices on the U.S. Supreme Court. It started by vice president, by governors. All these distinguished founding fathers started the American Bible Society. And that's why I was joking with Tim. These are all the atheist, agnostics, deists that professors tell us we had at the Founding Fathers who started the world's biggest Bible society. Really? See, what happens is people don't know enough of their history to even know they're being lied to. And so we have no clue who the Founding Fathers were or what they believed. And the American Bible Society, going back to it distributes 250 million Bibles every year. Every year it comes out with an annual report on what they call the state of the Bible. So when you look at the state of the Bible for 2022, which is measuring 2021, so they came out 3 years ago or 2 years ago looking at 2021, and what we found in 2021 was that Bible reading in America took a steep nosedive. We lost 25 million Americans who no longer read the Bible at all in 1 year. So that many Americans stopped reading the Bible. And that's not good for political prosperity, because political prosperity comes from religion and morality. If you're going to stop reading the Bible, you're going to lose religion and morality. And so the report came out just about 8 weeks ago for this year. It's the 2023 report, and it looks back to 2022, and we found that it turned down again. So we lost another 3 million Americans who no longer read the Bible at all last year. That makes 28 million Americans we've lost in the last 2 years. The result of that is we have a high biblical literacy now. We do a lot of work with George Barton and others, and we no longer, as Americans, know the Bible the way we used to know. There's 196 Christian colleges and universities in America. I talk to the presidents of colleges regularly, and they tell me now that Kids coming out of church kids coming out of church, going into Christian schools, no longer can largely tell the difference between Noah and Moses and Adam. They don't have a clue who those people are. They know so little about the Bible and Bible history. Even the great heroes have disappeared, not to mention American heroes. So even Bible heroes are no longer known. So religion and morality, that's what produces political prosperity. That's what we want. But let me show you just how recently we've kind of lost that political prosperity. Let me do a little bit of then and now. Let me take you back just a little bit. Let me go back to even 2 generations ago. Let me go back to World War II. World War II, the president was Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt in World War II, let me show you a statement he made. He says, in the formative days of the Republic, the directing influence the Bible exercised on the fathers of the nation is conspicuously evident. Can you show me textbooks today where the influence of the Bible and the founding fathers is conspicuously evident? Now, this is what the president's telling us back then, because we all knew it. This was in everybody's textbook. This was a piece of cake. We all knew the founding fathers were biblically oriented. The Bible was the basis of what they did in forming the nation. That's what he was saying back then. Now, significantly, how do we know whether he's right or not? Well, there's ways to know. If you go back to the Constitution we have, again, we're one Constitution out of hundreds that have been in the world history. But ours has been different because we've gone these 235 years. Nobody else even come close to that. And so when you look at that, where do these guys get their ideas? Because clearly they didn't take a compilation of the world's best constitutions. Let's take some of the Romanian Constitution, a little bit of Poland's Constitution. They didn't do that. They came up with novel ideas. And where did they get those ideas? Well, that was a question asked by political science professors at the University of Houston. They said, these guys, when they sat down to write the Constitution, where did they get their ideas? And so they said, if we can figure out where they got their ideas they put in the Constitution, we'll understand why the Constitution is unique. So what they did was their results are reported in a book called The Origins of American Constitutionalism. It's a great book. It documents their study. But what they did, they said, if we can go back and read their writings and see who they quoted, we'll know who was important to them. And that's a brilliant idea. If I were to follow you around all day with a smart device and record your conversations all day, at the end of the day, if I were to find who you quoted, I would know who's important to you by who you quote. So that's what they did. They found 15,000 writings out of the founding era. In those writings, they found 3,154 direct quotes, and they took every one of those direct quotes back to their original source. It took them 10 years to do this. At the end of 10 years, they said, well, we now know where they got their ideas because we've taken their quotes all the way back to the sources. And interestingly, the source of the idea is the #1 most cited individual in the writings of the founding era was Baron Charles Montesquieu. He's a Christian philosopher from France. He did a 2-volume set called The Spirit of the Laws, came out in 1750. It particularly talked about separation of powers and checks and balances, and that's a huge thing. And by the way, that's biblical oriented. If you'll take John Adams and George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, all 4 of those founding fathers said that what we have with checks and balances and separation of powers, which is unlike any other constitution, they said it came out of Jeremiah 17:9. They cite a Bible verse for the origin of that. But nonetheless, Montesquieu is the #1 cited individual in the founding era. #2 cited individual is Judge William Blackstone. He wrote a 4-volume commentaries on the laws, and particularly American attorneys study that. Thomas Jefferson said that American attorneys studied Blackstone's commentaries on the laws the same way Muslims studied the Quran. So American attorneys studied that book really hard. The 3rd most cited individual was John Locke. He did a book in 1690 called The 2 Treatises of Government. It was significant in our history. Richard Henry Lee, a signer of the Declaration, who made the motion that we separate from Great Britain and do the Declaration, he said, quote, we copied the Declaration out of Locke's 2 Treatises of Government. So that's the 3rd most cited individual. But they found that the most cited source was not an individual. It wasn't Montesquieu or Blackstone or Locke. The most cited source was the Bible. 34% of all their quotes came out of the Bible. The Bible, hands down, is the #1 most cited source in the American founding. It's interesting. One of the things that I'll do tomorrow, in the summer times, we do 1-week sessions for young people 18 through 25 that are going into college, because we know what they're going to get hit with in college. We speak at colleges all the time. So we go through kind of an apologetics of American history and Constitution, and we'll go through tomorrow, starting tomorrow with these young people, and we'll go through all these kind of apologetics, and we'll look at the Constitution, specific Bible verses quoted throughout the Constitution. Now, most Americans don't recognize that today because the Founding Fathers didn't put Bible references down because they didn't need to. Everybody knew, if I were to tell this group, for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten son, I wouldn't need to tell you that comes from John 3:16. A whole lot of people in America have no clue where that comes from. They think, oh, that's an interesting phrase. Well, that's what's happening today with the Constitution. We read it and we don't recognize the Bible verses in it because for us, they're pretty obscure Bible verses. Leviticus 19:17 and Leviticus 19:15, Deuteronomy 19:15. We don't know what those verses are. If you look the verse up, you'll find it in the Constitution. That's the wording they used. So that's the significance of that. And that's why when you look at the source of our ideas, that's why what President Roosevelt said back in World War II, it's easy to prove. This is the book that they used. He continued. He says, we cannot read the history of our rise and development as a nation without reckoning with the place the Bible's occupied in shaping the advances of the Republic. He said, there is no way you can read American history without seeing what the Bible did. Today, there's a whole lot of ways to read American history without having a clue what the Bible did. Because again, we have so secularized our own history that we don't even know what the documents are. And let me give you just one example of how the Bible shaped who we are. With all the constitutions that are out there, ours has what's called the due process clauses. In the Declaration of Independence, we set forth in 161 words up front, 6 principles of government. 6 principles, pretty simple. First, very straightforward. There is a creator. Principle number 2, the creator God gives to individuals inalienable rights. Position number 3, it's the purpose of government to protect God's inalienable rights for every individual. So that's in the Declaration. They did that in the Constitution. Particularly the Bill of Rights sets forth inalienable rights. There's about 17, 18 inalienable rights there. There's 5 in the First Amendment. There's 2 in the Second Amendment. But when you get down through the Fourth Amendment, through the 8th Amendment, those are what we call the due process rights. The right to confront your accuser. The right to compel witnesses in your behalf. The right to speak in your own defense, the right to have a trial by jury. Those are the due process clauses. They've made us different from every other nation in the world, and those were considered inalienable rights. Where they come from? If you practice federal law, there's a series of books called Federal Practice and Procedure. This is what you use in practicing federal law, and that volume of books would go from here to the wall. I mean, it is a long volume of books, and volume 30 in Federal Practice and Procedure has 20 pages on how that every one of the rights in the Bill of Rights, the due process clauses, came out of the Bible. For example, according to Federal Practice and Procedure, the right to confront your accuser comes out of John 8:10. The right to compel witnesses on your behalf is Proverbs 18:17. The right to speak in your own defense is Acts 22:1, and on it goes. Most Christians today have not a clue what the Bible says about due process rights. But we knew 2 generations ago, we knew. And this is the kind of stuff that President Roosevelt was talking about. And by the way, may I point out, he is a liberal, progressive Democrat. Nobody disagreed in religion back in the day. Well, we do today. Try to find me a liberal, progressive Democrat today that even acknowledges the authority of the Bible. That was not the issue back then. Democrats and Republicans would fight over how big the tax cut should be or should there be a tax cut, but they didn't fight over Bible and truth and religion and morality. That was not the issues. So look how far we've changed just in a couple of generations. Another president I'll take you to is President Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt said the teachings of the Bible are so interwoven and so entwined with our civic and our social life, it would be impossible for us to figure what life would be if these teachings were removed. According to Teddy, if you took the Bible out of our civic and social life, you wouldn't recognize America. Now, he didn't say our spiritual life. That was a given. He said the Bible is so much a part of our civic and our social. What in the world is he talking about? And again, there's lots of examples, but let me choose 2. When you look at economic systems around the world throughout history, there's a number of economic systems. The one that is probably the most prevalent throughout history is socialism. That's the one that was used when all the colonists came to America. The early colonists came, they were socialists. The king owned everything, the government owned everything. The king would let you use stuff and you would work for him and he would give you back what he thought you needed, but you didn't work for yourself, you worked for him. The land was his, he would give it to you if you really liked what you did, but he'd take it away from you and give it to somebody else. It was all socialism. socialism. And that's the way that people came to America. That's the way Jamestown Colony was. That's the way the Plymouth Colony was, etc. But the Plymouth Colony was a little different. Their governor, William Bradford, he kept extensive records. William Bradford said that when they got here, the Bible was a new book to them because it had been put up for 1,000 years in world history. You're not allowed to read it. The people who tried to get it in the common language, like Wycliffe and Huss and Tyndale, were burned at the stake for trying to get a Bible where people could read it individually. Well, the first English language Bible was printed in 1560, and that's the time that the Pilgrims are having their church and doing their stuff. And so when they come to America in 1620, the Bible is still a pretty new book. It's fairly recent. The Geneva Bible came out in 1560, and that's the Bible they brought to America with them. The King James had just come out, and they had that as well. But Bradford says that they would spend 4 to 6 hours a day in the Bible, rediscovering the truths of the Bible. And as they did that, in the years they were in Plymouth, they changed a lot of things, and one was their economic system. It's interesting that Bradford talked about when they changed their economic system. He said, we use socialism as if we were wiser than God. What's that mean? He says, when you read the Bible, it's really clear God's not a socialist. Now, that's not known today. 71% of millennials today think we should switch from the free market to socialism. 75% of college students think we should go from free market to socialism. So it's not known today that socialism is a really bad idea. We think it's a really good idea. But back then, they rejected socialism and adopted what we call the free market system. The free market system based on 5 Bible verses. 5 Bible verses, and William Bradford talks about verses like 1 Timothy 5:8, 2 Thessalonians 3:10, Matthew 25, Luke 19, Matthew 20. Those are all the verses that built the free market system, which is the most prosperous economic system in the history of the world, and it came out of the Bible. See, that's our civic and our social institutions, not our spiritual life, our civic and our social life, like our economic system. Another one is our form of government. If you study the Bible, there are 7 different forms of government illustrated in the Bible at various places. Founding fathers went through those 7 to decide what they wanted to be. They were coming out of a monarchy. Of course, monarchy is one of the big forms in the Bible. You got King Saul and King David and King Solomon and Rehoboam, and on it goes. But there were other forms of government as well. And of those 7 forms of government, the founding fathers looked at democracy. And they said democracy is worse than a dictatorship. Democracy, there are plenty of examples of it throughout the Gospels, particularly with the Romans, and founding fathers rejected it. They chose what we call a republican form of government. They cited 3 Bible verses for that. That was Exodus 18:21, Deuteronomy 1:15-16, and Deuteronomy 16:18. So we've adopted a republican form of government, rejected a democratic form of government, and yet the president today keeps saying that we need to save the democracy. No, we don't. Really bad idea. As a matter of fact, if anybody read the Constitution today, Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution explicitly prohibits America from becoming a democracy. Constitutionally, we're not allowed to be a democracy. We are a, quote, republican form of government. We have to provide that in every state throughout the United States. We even pledge allegiance to the flag to the Republic of the United States. Today, people don't know the difference between a republic and a democracy. It's all the same. No, it's not all the same. There's a huge difference between it. But again, this is where Teddy Roosevelt was saying, look, all this stuff, our civic and our social life, it's out of the Bible. Not just our spiritual life. And again, today, most folks don't know this aspect of biblical history. Let me take you to another president. Ulysses S. Grant was president on the 100th anniversary of America. He came out with a card on the 100th anniversary. You see the card here, top left, 1776, top right, 1876. That's a centennial, 100 years. He's the president. It says centennial, and it says, message of President Grant to the children and students of the United States. Children and youth. So what is the president going to tell the children and youth? Here's what he said. He says, hold fast to the Bible as a sheet anchor of your liberties. Write its precepts in your heart and practice them in your lives. He said, to the influence of this book, we're indebted for all the progress made in true civilization, and to this we must look as our guide in the future. Righteousness exalts a nation, sins or reproach any people. What do you think happens today if any president does that for the youth of America? But see, back then, he said, guys, the only way we keep America on track is if you stay in God's Word, because this is where we get all of our civilization. This is where we get all of our institutions. And we've allowed ourselves to be compartmentalized, that religion goes in church, it goes in our faith life, but it doesn't go in public life, and it does. So it is this mentality of the Bible in every aspect. And again, I don't have to go back to ancient time. I can just go back to World War II time and show you how different it was. So this is what produced American exceptionalism. Now, remember that George Washington talked about religion and morality. Let me show you the start of the government that they did. You have to go back to 1787 for the start of the federal government. They had state governments before that. They had colonial governments, but the start of what we call our constitutional federal government. They're meeting at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787 to write our Constitution. There was no one happier about that than Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin is the first guy in America's history to say we should be one nation with 13 states rather than 13 nations. So we all need to get together. He started promoting that way back in what was called the Albany Plan of Union. And that Albany Plan of Union was back in 1754. Other founding fathers weren't ready for it yet, but that's what Franklin is promoting. So what happens on 1787, we finally get together. It's been 33 years that Franklin's promoting this, and now we're here, and there's nobody happier about it than he is. Now, this is Franklin seated right there. And by the way, happy as he is by far the old man of the convention. At this point in his life, he's 81 years old, and that's not impressive today because the average lifespan in America today is 80 years old. A little throwback. The average lifespan in America in 1787 was 33 years old. He's sitting there at 81. By the way, I mean, when you were 18, you've already had your midlife crisis back then. So here Franklin sits, and he's loving what's happening, at least for the first few weeks. But by the fifth week, it's really evident that these guys are not going to agree on anything. It was fighting, it was bickering, it was fussing with one another. It was so bad that delegates were leaving and going home. Alexander Hamilton, I'm out of here. I'm going back to New York. I got better things to do than fight with you guys. George Mason, Virginia, back to Virginia. Washington said, you got to stay. We need you. It's falling apart literally. And that's when Franklin gave the longest speech that he gave at the convention. All the speeches back then were written down. They're in the notes. They were collected. Franklin, after he gave his speech, gave the notes to James Madison, who recorded the notes of the convention. And so on Thursday, June the 28th, 1787, Franklin gave this speech. And he's just talking to the guys, kind of pleading with them. Guys, you can't let this fall apart. You can't all go home. You got to stay. We got to work this out. This is what he told them. He said, in this situation of this assembly, groping as it were in the dark for political truth and scarce able to distinguish it when presented to us, how has it happened, sir, that we've not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understanding? He said, in the beginning of Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room for divine protection, and that is true. Back when Congress started in 1774 and they were meeting in that room, they started the first session of Congress with a 2-hour prayer meeting. So they started it off with 2 hours of prayer. They had Bible study. They studied 4 chapters of the Bible that morning. John Adams wrote, his wife Abigail said what had happened to Congress that morning. They called the nation to a day of prayer and fasting. He said, guys, don't you remember what we used to do in this room? He said, in the beginning concept of Great Britain, he says, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room for divine protection. He says, our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. All of us engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. And that's one of the fun studies of the Revolution, seeing the absolute, irrefutable miracles that God did that cannot be explained through any physical means, where that God flat changed. We won at least 4 major battles because God changed the weather in the middle of the battle, and the weather for some reason hit the British and not the Americans in the same battle. How do you do that? See, there's records, really clear records of what God did with weather, and we won some major battles because of the weather. And that's what he said. He said, guys, we've had so many examples of a superintending providence in our favor. He said, and have we now forgotten this powerful friend? Or do we imagine that we no longer need his assistance? He says, I have lived, sir, a long time. Yes, he had. He says, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. He said, if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We've been assured in the sacred writings that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. He said, I firmly believe this, and I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel, and we should become a reproach and a byword down to future ages. I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and his blessings in our deliberations be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business. Now, that's a slightly religious tone to that speech. And that is indisputably the least religious founding father. Franklin, hands down, the least religious. Nobody's going to dispute that. If he's the least religious, what does that tell you about the other guys? You know, that's why I was joking a minute ago, George Washington, the great deist founding father, because that's what they call him in college. He's a deist. Really? So what does that make him? I mean, he's the one they say is a deist. And by the way, college students hear that all the time. Well, Franklin in his autobiography said he's a deist. He sure did. When he was 15 years old, he said he was a deist. 2 paragraphs later, he said, that was one of the dumbest decisions I ever made. He said, I quickly left that behind. Now, what happens is professors, oh, Franklin says he's a deist. Yes, he did. And he said, that was a stupid idea. I'm not anymore. 2 paragraphs. Nobody talks about that part of history, and we just say, oh, they're a bunch of atheists, agnostics, deists. So that little speech you just saw of Franklin was 14 sentences long. Here's the question I've got for you. How many Bible verses did you see Franklin quote in those 14 sentences? The answer is 14 Bible verses. These are the Bible verses that Franklin just referenced. Now, notice he did not give a single Bible reference on any one of them, but everybody else in the room knew that those were Bible verses. The Bible literacy back then was remarkably high, and I'll give you evidence of that in just a little bit. So how is it that Franklin knew that many Bible verses as the least religious founding father? Well, pretty easy. Jesus gives us the answer. How did Franklin know those many Bible verses? How could Franklin speak Bible verses like that out of his heart? Jesus told us in Matthew 12:34, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Franklin could speak those Bible verses because he had memorized those Bible verses. They came flowing out of his mouth because he had done a lot of Bible memory work, and that's just one of many speeches of Franklin that I can give you. Franklin actually has a letter to Reverend Dr. Samuel Cooper. He said, you know, whenever I speak in Europe, he said, I have to tell people when I'm quoting the Bible because they don't know the Bible in Europe. He said, when I speak in America, I don't have to tell people when I'm quoting the Bible. Everybody knows the Bible here. We all memorize it over here. Really, we all memorize it over. We used to, and see, even Franklin was that. You may recall Patrick Henry, the famous speech he gave on "Give me liberty, give me death." The heart of that speech, and it was given at a point in time when we didn't have a military, we hadn't separated yet, but Great Britain keeps whacking us, and so and he's telling the guys in Virginia, you guys keep saying we don't have an army. We don't need an army if we'll stand up. If we'll stand up, God will come help us. And so it's a great speech that he gave, and that speech too is 14 sentences long. And it's 14. If you want to look up the 14 sentences, you'll find that the verses he used in that period of time were 11 verses. And these are the verses he used. And again, this was not a written speech. He was just getting up and passionate. He's just exploding at the other guys because they're reticent to join the fight. And the kind of Bible verses we memorize today, probably nobody's memorized Ecclesiastes 9:11 or 2 Thessalonians 1:6 or Daniel 4:6. Those aren't the Bible verses we memorize. Those are verses they memorized. One more example I'll give you is George Washington. George Washington became president in 1789. At that point in time, we had been 13 nations. Now we're one nation with 13 states, but that's going to take a real different mindset to get all the states to realize we're not separate, independent like we used to be. We're part of a group now. And so what Washington decided to do in 1790, he said, what I'm going to do as president, I'm going to go to every one of the 13 states and let them see me as president and just, hey, it's great that we're all working together now, and it's great that we're a nation, and just kind of help remind them that we've got a new system now. We're part of a constitutional system. And so he lays out the states that he goes to for each year, 1789, 1790, 1791. In 1790, he is going into Rhode Island. That's one of the states he's chosen. And as he's going into Rhode Island, as it's getting time for his visit, there is a Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island that hears that Washington's coming. And they're loving it because, and they wrote him really effusive letters. Saying, oh, we can't wait for you to be here. We so thank God for you, what you've done for religious liberty and what you've done for our freedom. And so it's just this gushy kind of letter. And so Washington writes back kind of a presidential letter, which is, well, that was a really nice letter you sent. Thanks. I look forward to seeing you when I get there. And here's just 2 paragraphs out of the letter he wrote back to them. He says, may the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. May the Father of all mercy scatter light and not darkness in our paths, and make us all in our several vocations useful here, and in his own due time and way everlastingly happy. Now, that is 2 sentences. How many Bible verses did he use in 2 sentences? Answer is 10. His whole thing was just one Bible phrase after another, and these are the verses that he used in those 2 sentences. How did these guys do that? Again, they memorized the Bible. They're just speaking what's out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. This is what they had memorized. But see, people today don't recognize it because we don't know the Bible well enough to recognize the Bible verses that are in it. And so we just look at that and say, oh, it's a bunch of atheist agnostics. No. The fact that we don't know the Bible doesn't mean that they don't know the Bible. And there's a huge difference to that. Matter of fact, one of the things about school education is we have records that go all the way back. We have records of the first public school law in Massachusetts, 1642 in Connecticut, and then 1647 in Massachusetts. And we can go all the way back and show you school records. There's town records on how many kids were at school and what they learned and what were their lessons, etc. And you can choose any state. We've got that for Texas. We're in Texas. We've got records here at the depository down in Austin of school records in Texas all the way back to when we were a colony, and then when we became a nation, and then when we became a state. So we've got all these records. And you could take any state, but I'm going to just take New Jersey for a minute. New Jersey, I want to show you the records of public schools in New Jersey, 1816. Public records, New Jersey, 1816. They're talking about what each of the kids learn as they go through the classes. And so here's the part on the report for the 1st and 2nd graders, what they call the 1st and 2nd classes in New Jersey public schools. It says, all the scholars of the 1st and 2nd classes, 1st and 2nd grade, commit to memory portions of the New Testament or Psalms, a lesson of the Catechism, several hymns, and the text of the preceding Sabbath. What's the text of the preceding Sabbath? Whatever preacher talked about on Sunday, we're going to memorize all those Bible verses he mentioned during the week. That's part of what all 1st and 2nd graders did in New Jersey. And with all the kids doing that, this is what all the kids in New Jersey memorized 1st and 2nd grade. There's always some kids that are smarter than other kids. I mean, this is the way it is. And they talked about one of those kids. They said, one of the scholars has committed to memory the book of John and the first 30 Psalms and the 119th Psalm. 1st and 2nd grader has memorized the Gospel of John and 30 Psalms and Psalm 119. Yeah, but that's a smart kid. The rest of them didn't do that. It says the majority have committed to memory the Gospel of John. Every 1st grader memorizes the Gospel of John. But we got one kid that also memorized 30 Psalms and Psalm 119. But everybody memorized the Gospel of John as a 1st grader in New Jersey. I don't know that I've ever met an adult who's memorized the Gospel of John. And this is the public schools of America. And it was this way until 1963. 1963, June 25th, 1963 is when the U.S. Supreme Court in Abington, Murray Correlette said, you know, we've had the Bible in schools for 160 years under the Constitution, for nearly 300 years in the nation, and it's just time to do something different. That's where judicial activism began, was in that decision. And so we think the way it is today is the way it's always been. The way it is today is the way that a judicially active court made it. We used to know and study the Bible. And so this is the kind of America we're talking about back then. And going back to Benjamin Rush, he's called the father of public schools under the Constitution. In 1791, he wrote a piece giving a dozen reasons we would never take the Bible out of schools in America. And this is what Dr. Rush said. He said, the Bible, when not read in schools, is seldom read in any subsequent period of life. And he's true. Since we've stopped reading the Bible in schools in '63, our biblical literacy has shot down. We don't know the Bible like we used to. It used to be something we learned very young. And as a result, when you look at where we are today, the biblical literacy is really high. Only 9% of Christians read the Bible on a daily basis. Not Americans, just Christians. Used to be all Americans read the Bible. And only 6% of Christians have a biblical worldview. In other words, only 1 in 16 Christians could put Bible verses beside economics. And Bible talks about the estate tax, it talks about the capital gains tax, it talks about the minimum wage, it talks about inheritance taxes, it talks about progressive taxes, it talks about flat tax. All those things are covered in the Bible. Jesus and Peter had a long conversation on the right kind of taxes and who's supposed to pay taxes. Is it citizens or is it foreigners who pay? Bible's full of economic. Only 1 out of 16 Christians can actually put Bible verses to economic policies or to immigration policies or anything else that the Bible talks about. So our biblical literacy is very high, and as a result, God's institutions have suffered. We know that God created various institutions. The first He created was that of the family. Genesis 1, 2, 3. God made man, He made woman. They had children, put them together. That's good. So that's the first institution God created. That's His institution. The second institution God created is in Genesis 9. It's civil government. After Cain killed Abel and the whole world just went downhill, God said, okay, let's just wipe it out with the flood and let's start again. And so when Noah is getting off the ark in Genesis 9:4, God delivers to him the start of what's called the Noahide Code. It's the first civil law. First law there, whoever sheds man's blood, by him will man's blood be shed, Genesis 9:6. Capital punishment. If someone kills someone else, take that person out. Or someone, not kills, if someone murders. Big difference between killing and murder. Justified killing, Bible is all, it defends that. Murder is what you can't do. So if someone murders, take them out. And so that Noahide code deals with things like theft and murder. And it's a civil code. God gave it to Noah when he got off the ark. God established civil government right there. And the third institution is that of the church. The church, we know throughout the New Testament, the type and shadow of the church would be back in Exodus. When God gets his people out in the wilderness, he gets them to the mountain. He said, okay, I want you to have a tabernacle. I want the congregation. Here's how I want worship to be. And so God establishes what we would call the church back then, the congregation. So those are God's three institutions. And with God's three institutions, probably the one that Christians today know the least about is that of government. Now, that's not a problem in previous generations because we understood that government was an institution of God. We studied it like we studied the family of the church. Great example is that book I mentioned earlier, John Locke. He did the 2 treatises of government. This is the book, the third most cited individual. This book in 1690, you can still get it today. That book is less than an inch thick. It's less than 400 pages. John Locke, in less than 400 pages, showing how civil government is to operate. He references the Bible more than 1,500 times on the operation of civil government. Now, I do a lot of pastors' conferences. We were just this past week in Washington and Oregon, and we'll do 2 or 3 pastors' conferences a day across the state. And so I can ask a group of pastors, name all the verses you can think of on civil government. And if I get a dozen verses named, it's a big time. 1,500? Really? See, we don't know what the Bible says about civil government anymore because we tune that out. Christians don't do that. And so we just tune it out, and we don't even pay attention to what's in there. And so those 3 institutions, as a result, what's happened is Americans have really, we've kind of left the government side out of things. That's not part of our focus as Christians. And as a result, we've really become 2/3 Christians. Pretty good on the family, pretty good on church, but we're not good on government. We've got to become 3/3 Christians. We've got to get back involved in that arena. We've got to be able to focus on that arena. And in looking at all 3 of those arenas, Charles Finney, who's a revivalist. Charles Finney is part of the Second Great Awakening. It's estimated that Finney himself, just in the year 1857, 1858, led 100,000 people to Christ just in 1 year. And you think about that, without technology, without all the stuff we have today, 100,000 in 1 year, phenomenal. Well, Finney was a revivalist, and he believed in revival. He believed we should have revivals. And as a result, he wrote a book in 1835 on how to have revivals, how to experience revival. And that book he did in 1835, it's really different from what we do. If we want a revival today, we've got to pray for a revival. He said, no. You don't have to pray for revival. That's not what you do. And he went through the Bible verses that God says, if then. God says, if you'll do this, then I'll do this. In other words, you don't have to pray about it. Just do what he said and you're going to get the result. So one of the 2 Chronicles 7:14, if my people which are called by my name will do this, then I will do this. He said, if you want him to do this, then you do that now. Part of that is praying, but that's not the sole thing. There's a whole lot that goes with it. And so he goes through all the if-then verses in the Bible. And it's interesting as he does this in lecture number 15, this what he says in lecture number 15. He said, the church must take right ground in regard to politics. He said, politics are part of a religion in such a country as this, and Christians must do their duty to the country as part of their duty to God. Now, that's pretty stiff all over, but again, they understood there were three institutions, and what happens is if you have a revival now, and it broke out in schools, schools are going to crush that revival. They already do anyway. They tell the kids, you can't express your faith publicly here. You can't share your faith with others. We've got a system that if we had a revival break out, it would try to crush that revival. That's why you have to have government on the side, because otherwise it will crush it. And it's doing that now. It's crushing the family, and it's crushing sexuality, it's crushing gender, it's crushing all the stuff that it doesn't agree with, which is why you have to be involved, that you have to get different policies. And he concludes, he says, God will bless or curse this nation according to the course that Christians take in politics. You see, he ran a college back then, a Christian college, first college in America to treat men and women, blacks and white, as equal. But if you're going to be in his college, you had to be politically involved. You had to be actively involved in the Underground Railroad. You had to actively oppose the fugitive slave law. That's just part of being in a Christian college back then. You have to get righteousness into policy, and that means politics. And so it's interesting, that lecture number 15, he called it Hindrances to Revival. If you want to hinder a revival, stay out of politics. That's not the way we've been taught to think, but even the Second Great Awakening, people are praying for revival today. Do you really want one? Because go back and look at the First Great Awakening, look at the Second Great Awakening, look at where Christians were in politics. That's part of it. That's part of what a revival is, and that's what he shows biblically as well. Dr. Benjamin Rush, I started with Dr. Rush, one of my favorite founding fathers. Dr. Rush, as I mentioned, is called the father of public schools under the Constitution, and it's because of this piece that he did in 1790. And this piece in 1790, Dr. Rush, it's called the Mode of Education Proper in a Republic. He said, look, we used to be 13 nations, now we're one nation. With this one nation, what are we going to have to teach in order to stay one nation with 13 states? What do our schools need to be teaching? And so he goes through and talks about that, and it was the next year that he came out with giving a dozen reasons we would never take the Bible out of schools. But in the initial one they did in 1790, it's interesting. He said the purpose of public education is threefold. He said the number one purpose of public education is to teach students to love and serve God. He said the number two purpose of public education is to teach students to love and serve their country. He said the number three purpose of public education is to teach students to love and serve their family. Notice the order. God, country, family. Nearly every Christian I know today would say, no, 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 that's out of order. It should be God, it should be family, and it should be country, because family is so much more important. And Dr. Rush says, no, you're wrong. It should be God, it should be country, and it should be family. Because as he pointed out, if you ever lose control of your country, it will become the great enemy of your family. And that's exactly what we're seeing now. With the school boards or city councils or state legislatures or anything else, we've lost control of our country, and now in the midst of preserving our family, we gave our country away, and now the country's attacking our family, and it's being really difficult. This is why we have to get back involved in all these arenas, all three of God's arenas. We have to become 3/3 Christians again. That's a significant part of who we are to regain. And this is part of having a revival too, quite frankly. We have to get back in these areas. I'll close with this challenge. Came from Matthias Burnett. He was one of the great preachers back in the American founding, and he summarized what they had been taught back then and what they were teaching and what was being taught from the pulpit as well. He said, to God and posterity, you're accountable for your rights and your rulers. Now that's interesting that we answer to God for our rights and our rulers. Our rights aren't up to us, that's up to the government. No, he said, no, no. You will answer. See, they saw it as a stewardship. John Adams and other founding fathers explained it very well. We would stand before God one day and account to God. We all know that Jesus tells us in Matthew 12, every idle word we speak we'll give account of. We know from 1 Corinthians 4 that our thoughts we'll give account of. We know from Hebrews 4 that our actions will account to God for that. We'll stand before him and have to account for it. And he'll say, I gave you your life. What'd you do with your life? We'll have to account for that. And he'll either say, well done, good and faithful servant, or he'll say, thou wicked servant, depart from me into eternal fire. And they'll say, I gave you your family. What'd you do with that? Well, Lord, they turned out really well. I raised them in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. I loved my wife. I respected my husband. All the things you said. Well done, good and faithful servant. I gave you your possessions. What'd you do with that? I was a good steward of it. Not only did I tithe, I gave offerings as well, and I helped the poor, everything you said. I gave you your country. What'd you do with that? Oh, I decided not to get involved in that one. That's not an acceptable answer. It's a stewardship that he gave us. Did you know that in the early founding era and all the way through almost the Civil War, voter turnout in America was 100%? Because everybody believed their vote, they would account to God for what they did with their vote. Well, I didn't do anything with my vote. Well, you remember what happened to the servant who didn't do anything with what had been given by the master? You wicked, slothful servant, cast in outer darkness. I don't do voting. You've got to, because God gave it to you as a stewardship country. That's how we maintain the country. And right now, Christian voter turnout is, in a presidential election, only 36% of adults in America vote in a presidential election. For the last 11 presidential elections, 54% of registered adults vote, but only 65.3% of adults are registered to vote. So when you take 54% of 65.3%, you find that 38% of American adults vote in a presidential election. That means for the last 11 presidential elections, 1 out of 5 Americans, or 18%, is what chooses the winner. So 1 out of 5 Americans chooses the winner of the president. We could go in any direction we wanted to if Christians would get back involved in the process. And that's part of the stewardship. And so that's what they taught back then. And that's why when Daniel Webster, for example, ran for Congress in 1820, there were 5,000 adults in his district and 5,000 votes were cast in his district. Everybody voted because they were accountable to God for the ruler that they chose. And they chose, I think Daniel Webster got 4,990 votes out of the 5,000. So, it was clear who they thought the good guy was. But again, it's Christian involvement. So he closes with this. He said, "Let not your children have reason to curse you for giving up those rights and prostrating those institutions which your fathers delivered to you." We've been given them just an unbelievably remarkable trust of the Lord. When he comes and we offer it back to him, is it in better shape than it was or worse shape than it was? How good of stewards have we been? And this is, and I'll just give you one more example. Talked about the fact that it's only 36% of adults that vote in a presidential election. It's only 26% of adults that vote for governor and U.S. senator and congressman. And when you get to the local level, it's right around 3 to 4% that vote for school board and mayor, et cetera. If you go to a city like Los Angeles, Los Angeles is the second largest city in the United States. If you're Eric Garcetti, who is mayor of Los Angeles, that's like being a governor in 23 separate states. That's how big the population of Los Angeles is. Eric Garcetti was elected mayor of Los Angeles with 2.9% of the vote. He was super hostile to churches. There's enough churches in Los Angeles, they could have anybody they want for mayor. 2.9%. You go to Houston. Houston, Anise Parker, first open lesbian elected mayor in Houston, was elected with 3.3% of the vote. She went after the pastors and said, "Hey, you guys, if any of you say marriage between a man and a woman, I've got you, because that now is a violation of city law." How'd that happen? Because only 3.3% elected her to office. There's enough churches in Houston to have anybody they want. And it's that way with school boards, it's that way with city councils, it's that way across the United States. There's nobody else to look at for where the nation has gone except we who are the stewards of the nation who haven't done a good job. So for revival to happen in America, we have to get back involved in all of God's institutions. We have to think biblically. I encourage you to become as smart as a first grader in New Jersey, memorize long passages of the Bible. Try memorizing the Gospel of John. This is what gave us the foundation that have made us remarkable. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, at the back there's a book table just out the side, and we've got things like The American Story. Goes through this kind of history probably that you didn't get in school, but it's all documented, all footnoted, it's all there. Same with the Founder's Bible that shows the Bible verses the Founding Fathers used for specific policy, like the due process clauses, etc. It shows the verses they used in making those policies. So if you're interested in that, that's out at the back. Thank you guys for letting me share. God bless you. Tim?